What year did you graduate from Ranger School?
48.
And how long had you worked for the Forest Service before you went to Ranger School?
Oh, I started in 35. So it was 10 years. 10, 11 years.
Did you have to write an exam to get accepted to Ranger School?
Yeah, I think so. They had to form some opinion of how you got the amount of time, and we didn't have any greenhorns in our crew. They had some from the coast. Just nincompoops who didn't know a thing, and they didn't last.
Where were you when you first went to work for the Forest Service? Was it
Slocan.
Slocan, not Lardeau.
I went to work for the forestry for $45 a month under the federal government program at that time for 3 years. For about when school let out till September. And then I applied for a job here, so they put me up to Duncan. Then I came back here, and I stayed here till 46. I quit in 46. Went in the transfer business in town here.
In Kaslo.
And that, I went with a partner, and that was a bad deal. Jacobs, Alec Jacobs. You know Bruce's father?
Yeah.
He was an Air Force type, and he thought that's the way you should run a transfer business. Anyway, then that didn't work out in the winter, so I went into Nelson one day and in March, and of course I knew the guys all pretty well. And I went to the assistant district forester, Alec Cameron. Not Alec. Name is Cameron. Ian Cameron. And I said, hey, have you got any jobs? And I quit in August the previous summer. And they said, well, what happens if we have a fire in Kaslo? And I said, if you have a fire, I'll be there, and I'll do everything you want me to do. But I want to go in this transfer business. I had a house up the hill here, sold it, and used it to buy the transfer. So when I got in there, he said, yeah, you quit last year, didn't you? And I said, yeah. I said, that was a mistake. He said, we're starting a new ranger district in Elko. How'd you like to take charge of that? I said, I'm your man. Just put my name down. So the 1st April I went to Elko, and there was nothing there. We rented an old store. Elko had been a logging and mining town, and there was a power dam there, and that's the only living that anybody made at that time. And they logged over across the valley, about 10 miles away. And there was a little sawmill not far. And there had been a forest ranger at Waldo, which is 8 or 9 miles down. It was a big mill, quite a big mill. And during the Depression, they decided to it folded up, and so they didn't no need of a forest ranger anymore. So then things got a little, there's a bonfire area, a big flat valley, 14, 15 miles wide, and high incidence of lightning, and roads everywhere. Old railroad grades where they logged, and logging roads, horse roads, and so on. So that's why they started it up again. And we had an old store as an office, just nothing. So I was there I went to ranger school that fall, the spring, 1st of January in 48. And then when I came back, they said, how'd you like to go to Kaslo? Well, I knew the boats and so forth, and that was important, Oh, sure. So, spent a year back. I went to ranger school again that fall. So that was 6 months I spent there. And then in 49, I was full-time in Kaslo, got married, had this youngster, and then in 1950, Kaslo, Cranbrook showed up. So, I always believed that you go to a new place and you learn something new. You never learn anything by staying stagnant in one place. So, we moved into the old courthouse there. They built us a new station in 1950. I moved into that. And then 2 years later, they split it into two, Cranbrook East and Cranbrook West. And because it was just too big. So I took Cranbrook West, which was Fort Steele and the river, and that's how I got farming. Mm-hmm. So finally in 63 I quit again. So I went completely farming then. That didn't turn out too well, so too much risk in it. So I sold out there, came back to Slocan, fiddle-diddled around there for a couple of years, drove a school bus. And then I went to the ranger who I knew quite well by the name of Jupp, who had been at Elko after I was there. And I said, you got any jobs? He said, yeah, I got a job in the Lookout. How'd you like to take that on? All the time I had serviced lookouts. Every year. I had never been on the lookout as a lookout man. So I said, yeah. So they put me on Idaho. I was there for 2 summers. Most enjoyable summers I ever had. Except too many people. But that was interesting. You ever been up on Idaho?
No, I haven't gone up there.
It's much easier to get at than Idaho than well, Buchanan you can drive right to the top. Idaho you have to walk. You wouldn't want to go up there, I suppose.
Yeah, actually I've always wanted to go for a drive up to Idaho Lookout. I know they're... You went to work as a lookout for a couple of years.
You did?
And you did. At the end of your career.
Oh, yeah.
After having been a ranger.
Yeah, and I saw, of course, the ranger downtown knew that he didn't have to keep bugging me to see that I was there. He would know that I would be there when necessary. So he didn't bother me, not the slightest. If I wanted something, they hauled it up, no question. But I did a lot of wandering around here, and I saw a lot of things in nature that I normally wouldn't have. Ordinary people wouldn't have seen. Ordinary lookout men wouldn't be looking, They all they think they are supposed to do is look at the horizon and see what's there, which is fair enough. It's fair enough. But they aren't interested in the wild. If you've been brought up in the wild, everything you see is of interest. Everything, no matter how small.
Did you have a telephone down to New Denver from there?
No, we had radio.
Had they used telephones, these long Forest Service telephones in other parts?
No, they never did have a telephone on. And they did away with the one at Lardeau in about 3 or 4 years. This is the first one they had. That's the introduction of radios right there. That one with Bradshaw on it.
Mm-hmm. That was at Lavina.
Lavina, yeah. Lavina was... it was one of the first lookouts. They had one on Old Glory out of Rossland. But that turned into a federal government aircraft deal, so that, and also a weather station. They had people up there all year round eventually. But I first went there when I was 16. I knew the assistant ranger who I started with in Slocan, and I used to live with him, as a matter of fact, when I was a kid. So I went over to visit him and got a chance to climb up this lookout, Old Glory. But that was the first one, and I think they had a phone up there. And there was another one, Copper Lookout, out of South Slocan. And I think it had radio. I don't think it had.
What was it? What were the lookouts like? What kind of structure did they have? Were they steel towers or wood?
Very, very, very. Very, just tents. Just tents to start with. And there was a great danger of them getting blown off. Where's that one of Bradshaw? No, I don't think we even had the tent up that year. That time, that was the first day. But then they built, have you been to this one up here?
I've not been up Buchanan, no.
Oh, it's made out of cement blocks. Mm-hmm. Well, 2 stories. Bottom was for storage and the top was for lookout. Mm-hmm. Windows all around. So when they first started out, they were pretty primitive. Yeah, I sure like to know who that is.
What was your first job when you were 16 and went to work for the Forest Service? What did you do? Firefighting?
Firefighting, yeah. No, I didn't start. I was firefighting when I was 16. Every year after that, until I got to be this ranger assistant, they called him. I worked for the federal government in 35. So it was about 5 years.
And was that seasonal as well? When you worked on this special program as the assistant to the ranger, was that just for the summer?
Yes, you were under his supervision. Yeah.
Was that for firefighting too? Or did you do
Oh, yeah. Oh, everything there was to do.
Like what?
We got $45 a month and board if we went firefighting. Or if we worked out of town, we'd get paid for our lunch and so forth. That's Lockie there. He was a polio victim when he was young. Tough. He went firefighting. Every time he had a fire, he was there. And he limped along, but didn't want any help. You know, he just ornery and just and did a good job, you know. Didn't want any sympathy. I don't know but what that might be Jimmy Robinson, who was the ranger at that time.
Was Jimmy Robinson ranger in Kaslo and then he moved to Lardeau?
There were two Jimmy Robinsons. One was G.T. Robinson, which was the forestry one. And the other Jimmy Robinson, I can't remember his initials, he was the fisheries officer. Jimmy went to Nelson as scaling supervisor, and then he went to Kamloops. That's a bit of another thing that the forestry got involved with was the fisheries.
Mm-hmm.
Up until 1942, when they tore the railway track out and put the highway in, the forestry used to handle, like we had a speeder and a flat car. And so we had to get permission from the road foreman to get on the track. There was only one foreman at Lardeau at the time. And he didn't really like the Forest Service. There was a nuisance, you know. So you had to contact him. If it was Sunday, you had to tell him that you were going up the line. Otherwise, you might run into you, you know. And 33 miles a line.
Mm.
So we used to haul their eggs from Girard down, and we hauled them on the Amabilis down to here, and they picked them up here themselves. As a matter of fact, they had a bit of a hatchery down at the park. Mm-hmm. Have you got any information on that?
Not about the one here.
So anyway, that was how we got involved with the fisheries. We hauled their supplies up, and if they needed somebody to move out, they did. We loaned them radios. They didn't have any radios of their own. When the highways built the road after they tore the rails out, we supplied them and supervised. We hauled them back and forth and gave them radios. So we were quite involved with the whole welfare of the Slocan Valley, or the Kaslo, Lardeau Valley. I'll get it right after a while. And don't know of anything else to tell you about the fisheries up there. Down here, well, the second year I was on was in 39, and they were hauling eggs down here, and they had troughs. And this Bud Thompson, he lived, just about 2 blocks away. He had 3 kids, and he married a McNichol. He married Nellie McNichol. And he died, and she died a few years later. I don't know where the kids are. But anyway, they had 12-inch wooden troughs, about 16 feet long, I presume. And they filled them, they were about 8 feet deep, filled them full of spawn, hatched them. They had to be careful with, had to control it all the time. They literally had thousands of kokanee or Kamloops trout out of Gerard hatching down here in the park. And he used to have to get out early in the morning, which he hated to do. He didn't like getting up, because the robins would sit on the edge and pick the fish out. Now, here again, I used to be wandering down there, and he told me about this, and I could hardly believe it. But after watching for a while, there were other birds used to come and steal them, but you'd never expect a robin to, Kingfishers, they had come, but they were up off the ground, so no other animals. And when you go down to the park there, just where the road goes around the top end of the park, around the north end of the park, there's a little group of flat-top trees. Do you remember them? Mm-hmm. That was an island, believe it or not. A man-made island. And they dug this trench all the way around outside, thinking that when the fish got big enough, they could let them out of those troughs and put them down in there, and they would grow. Good thinking. Except that they didn't stop to think that the lake would go down, and there'd be no water. And so then they discovered that the fish didn't grow too well. And the trouble was that the water came from up where the present water comes from now, and it was too cold, and the fish wouldn't develop. So there was 2 reasons to abandon this, and they built that scout hall, which is there now, with the idea of putting the fish in there. And I think they had them in there 1 year. And then they moved the hatchery into Nelson, because the water was warmer. And this completely wiped this hatchery bit out, so all the eggs went from Gerard down to Nelson. And I think it says somewhere in a book where they shipped eggs and all over the country. Yeah. And of course they've stopped doing that now. The only eggs that move out of there now are the first 10 fish they catch in the spring, and they go to their own little hatchery right there, and they develop them there. Some go to Bull River Hatchery, which is a fair piece of operation. They had trouble over there too. There was an American owned all those big fields, and he used herbicide, and that wiped the whole slaughter out one year. They let them go. They had kokanee there too. They raised kokanee there. And that's where all the kokanee came from that inhabit that creek right there, because they came back in the fall. People don't like to believe that, but that's what happened. At East River.
Yeah.
That was much longer than this one. It has a story too. Just trying to figure out whether I think, and this cable, I had to devise a way to drop it out of the aircraft. And as you realize, that whole country was timber and swamp. And there was no wide places in the river where you could drop it and find it. So the trap door in the aircraft was about 18 inches square. And you couldn't dangle a cable down. You had to compact it. So I built a wooden box around this cable. Mm-hmm. I wrapped it in a coil. Mm-hmm. And it had to be less than the hole, but not very much. And the object was, as you're flying over, you couldn't let it down easily because the airstream would jam it. Mm-hmm. So you had to get ready and give it a push. So at that time, we had a beyond middle-aged fellow who was the observer, and he wasn't much for this kind of thing. So this fellow Hicks, who was the pilot out of Kaslo, this was a land job and a wheel job, and he had got this young Doukhobor interested in going along. Whether he got paid or not, I don't know. But anyway, he and I are up in the plane, and we flew back and forth, and he said, "Now, where do you want it dropped?" And I'm trying to look out the side and find out where the cable was and not drop it in a swamp or in the river or in a tree. So I said, okay, we'll go back down again a couple of times. And when we went down there, I said to the young guy, okay, we'll get ready now. And I'm looking out the edge, and I said, now. So we both pushed it straight down so that it fell free of the plane. So the following week I went back and looked for it. I had hung 2 or 3 rolls of toilet paper on so that when it let go, they'd string out in the air, so we might find it. No way, we never did find it. So anyway, this guy Hicks, that same fall, he was quite a drinker. He always would make a quart bottle under his seat, have a guzzle as he drove along. And this time he's going back home, and he said to this young Doukhobor kid, "Hey, I think I'll fly under the bridge." Do you know where the Doukhobor Bridge is?
Yeah.
Okay, he flew under that.
In a beaver.
No, not a beaver. No, this is a little one-motor job. No, it wasn't a beaver. But there was no dam there then. So he had a straight shot at it. And I guess every time he went back to Kaslo, he'd get looking at this bridge and think, geez, I'd like to fly under it. So this day he flew under it. but that was his last trip. Never made any more. He got fired right there. Well, he was a good pilot, but, you don't need people like that around.
Was it common to try and drop things out of planes, some building supplies, materials?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we used to drop groceries and all that sort of thing. Oh, that's what that 18-inch hole was for. Oh, yeah. But then a camp would be out in the open, and they could find it. And they may have tried parachutes, but not very often. And of course, the stuff was smashed all to hell when they got down there. But going back to this cable crossing,
were the cable crossings part of the trail system? So the trail would go up and you'd...
Well, there was no access to the east side of the river. Absolutely none from the East River crossing. Right up to where the creek got small enough so you could fall a tree across. You couldn't fall a tree anywhere across the Lardeau or the Duncan, where the water was just too fast. Mm-hmm. We did at one time, that year before this, I guess, I did get the notion of going down to the mouth of Hall Creek. We crossed Hall Creek and went down on the north side, and there were some big trees there. This is no chainsaws then. And I had these guys fall these trees across the creek, but every time they'd wash down. And this time we had a big cedar and spruce. We had quite a pile of them all together. And I threw a line over. And we already had a crew on the other side fighting this fire, right across from Hall Creek. And they tied this line to a tree, and I went around the other side. And it was 3 miles up to this crossing and down. See? No trail on the other side. And when we got over there, I kept looking at this line and felt the cable, and finally I said, no way, nobody's going across there. If they'd gone in, they would have never got out. The water was fast. So we abandoned that idea altogether. We had a cabin at Duck Lake. Mm-hmm. Have you got that?
It's still there, that cabin.
The lake is still there, but it's under a new name. It's on the map as a new name. But they called it Duck Lake. And we had a cabin right on the west side of it. It was a pretty good cabin built during the Depression. There were lots of people lived at Hall Creek, panning gold. And in 35, 6, 7, and about that time. A few of them made a few dollars. This Earl Stevens had a trap line that went all the way up past Hall Creek. Mm-hmm. And, right to the head. It mentions it in the book. I stayed in his cabin up at what we called Westfall. It was where the Duncan split, or where the forks came together. I went a couple of miles above that. He had a cable crossing of his own, one pulley on a telephone wire. You can believe that I looked at that very, very carefully before it wasn't much of a creek, but quite a drop. If you drop, you'd break a leg, you know. That's no place to break a leg when you're 20 miles by yourself. So I went back and forth over it several times. And
was interested in what the Amabilis looked like and who operated it.
All you have to do is go behind the museum in Nelson, and there it is. Up on rails.
Wow.
You know where the museum is?
Yes.
Okay, just stop there and walk in behind it, and there it is.
Huh. Did the Forest Service give it to the museum?
No, I think the Forest Service had sold it to maybe KFP. I'm not sure about that. And it laid on the beach there, just below the police station, new police station, for years. And then somebody thought that should go in the museum, so they went to a lot of trouble because it wouldn't float, you know, holes in the bottom. But it's right there.
How did you use it?
How?
Yeah.
Well, there was no transportation between here and Lardeau. Or along the lake. So we took firefighters wherever we had to go. Took supplies up the lake and that sort of thing.
Did you have someone whose job it was to run it?
Oh, yes, yes.
Who was that?
Oh, a number of people. I ran it in the off-season, but a fellow by the name of Bradshaw was one of the last ones. Yeah, there were quite a number of different people in the summertime.
Was it also used for other purposes?
No, it was just straight forestry, transportation. I remember one instance, a fellow that was a lookout man up here, and Jimmy Robinson wanted to do some cruising up at Schroeder Creek. So I was to take them up there. And of course, you couldn't get within 6 or 8 feet of the shore because it drew about 3 feet of water, you know. So he had a pair of high boots on. Robinson did. And the other fellow, he wasn't too sure what to do, and he wasn't used to our boat, although he'd been around a couple of years. And he said, how am I going to get ashore without getting wet? Because they were going to cruise all day, see, and he wouldn't want his boots wet. So I said, well, there's a pike pole here, and I'd ordered these pike poles specially. They were about 20 feet long, and they weren't on the boat before. But, you know, you have a boat that big, and you got to be able to reach the bottom, you know, ward off rocks and logs. And so I said, well, when you get to the bow, you take this pike pole and stick it down in the bottom, and then jump ashore. And I could see that he was not paying too much attention. So he got the pike pole and he fidgeted around. He already threw his pack sack and his lunch ashore. And he got hold of this thing and let go and slid straight down into the water. So I didn't say anything. I cut the pike pole back and put it on board and headed home. But you'd think, even as a kid, you know, you learn to use the pole to jump with. And I never thought for a minute that he wouldn't know how to handle it. He's a guy of 50 years old. Those are some of the interesting little things that go on. So
Could it go up the river at the head of the lake? Up the Duncan?
Oh no, you couldn't take that up the river. No. It was a screw drive thing, so it was at least 3 feet, maybe 4 feet.
How did it handle the lake? Because the lake can be quite rough.
Very, very rough. I had Tomlinson one day, and we were tied up at Argenta. This is before the railroad went in. And we'd come down from Hauser, and when we hit the lake, I said, look at that lake, we're not going out on that. It was absolutely white, just white. We can afford to wait a while. Yeah, he said, and he was an old seafaring man, sailed around Cape Horn when he was 16. So when we got down to the wharf, we're getting ready to unload our truck and our stuff and so forth, and we could see the CPR Moyie and barge over at Lardeau. They were unloading or loading cars, getting ready to leave. And these people on the wharf came running over and, could you take us over to the barge, the CPR, so we can go downtown? And I said, we've already sorted that out, and we're not going out in the water. It's too rough. Well, yeah, we know it's rough, but this woman has got a 2-week-old baby. One of the tars, I think, was. And she's got to catch that boat Saturday, I said, I'm sorry, it's just too rough. So Tomlinson went down to pacify them onto the wharf. And he came back and he said, they're desperate. And I said, you know as well as I do that it's not safe to take that boat out in that water, because you're angling across, And he said, yeah, well, I'll go back and tell him. He hasn't gone 5 minutes and he's back again. Well, I said, okay, but I'm not responsible for this deal. So I said, what we'll do, we're in behind the wharf, you see. I said, we'll get the woman and her baby on and all her luggage, and we'll tie a line on so that we can let the boat loose and go around and head into the storm. Because the water was breaking over the wharf, And, well, that's fine. So he was out in the bow, and these people eased us back, and I had the motor warmed up and running. Headed out. And there was that much water went over the bow.
3 feet.
Every wave, And stuff was rattling around in the back, and I sent him in the back to have her sit in the middle, so when the boat rocked, the baby wouldn't get too upset, He went back to anchor down the dishes. It was rattling. We headed across the lake, quartered into the waves at about, maybe 2 miles an hour, just as slow as it would go. And every wave it'd dip under about 2 feet of water. When we got to the other side, Moyie was out with the barge in the bay, waiting for us. They knew we were coming because the phone was busy back and forth. So we got in behind her and unloaded. We got over to the wharf and tied up, and Levesque, who was the station agent there at that time, he came down and he said, every once in a while that ruddy boat disappeared. And then there'd be a big red flash, which was the red lead on the bottom. It had come up and then it had disappeared. And he said we were sure concerned. I said, don't think for a minute I was. Anyway, it turned out all right. But if it had tipped over or anything had happened to it, if the motor had quit or anything, we could have got out because it was only a mile to the shore, and we could have washed up in the sand, but the baby would not have, So, one time I was coming down in the wintertime, and I had tied up at Argenta, and I was doing some trail work after I got through after the 1st of October up Hamel Creek. And when I came down, the fog, you've probably seen it, about 2 feet above the water, just, you can't see a thing, And I knew where Argenta was, or where Lardeau was, but for some reason the compass had been taken out of the boat. So I headed in what direction I thought, and the wind was changing. There was very little wind anyway, and the ruffle was changing. And I got mixed up. So I'm heading out, and all of a sudden, there's a great cottonwood snag in front of me. I'm going slow. I was heading for Kaslo, but I wanted to go to Lardeau first. I was getting close to dark, and I saw this snag, and I thought, where on earth could that snag? Suddenly I remember it's the mouth of the river. I'd got turned around, and I was started up the river, so I just backed off and went back and headed right for Kaslo. I never went into Lardeau. But those were interesting little things,
Did people expect that kind of help from the Forest Service? The ride across? Was that sort of service from forestry expected?
In those days, you didn't quibble about it. You did what had to be done. Because people expected it, It was a Forest Service at that time. And so, you gave service, And, if the boat had turned over and we'd lost that youngster, I would have got blamed for it. But you don't think about things like that, You do what people ask you to do, and if you think it's reasonable. I didn't think it was reasonable, but old retiree Tomlinson said, yeah. He had been in much worse storms, but not on the lake. He said that was the worst storm he'd ever seen on Kootenay Lake, and I believe that. I don't ever remember seeing it that bad, but it was just pure white, And of course, when you get to the north end of the lake, it becomes shallower, so the waves become more aggravating,
Did it work the other way too, in the way that people related to you?
No. Just casual people who wanted to help. See, she would have had to wait a whole week because the Moyie wouldn't come over for her. It was too rough for them. And they didn't have a boat there. They had lots of boats, but they wouldn't take them out,
There were lots of boats at the Argenta wharf that could have taken her across.
Oh, there was, several of them. They owned one themselves, But it was just too rough. They wouldn't go. So, anyway, we made it. Another interesting lake story that I had. I left Lardeau one day, and we always knew when to expect the Moyie. And when I went, it was absolutely flat calm. And I had never seen a mirage before. I came around the corner at Lardeau to head down the lake, and there she is, stopping at Johnson's Landing. And she's about the height of herself off the water. And I was just amazed at that. But that was a mirage. I headed towards her, and as I got towards her, she settled down and was on the water. But that's the first time I ever saw a mirage, and I was just amazed, Probably the last time I'll ever see one. I spoke to Tomlinson, and he said, oh, yes. Yes, he saw lots of them when he was at sea. But here was a great space between the water and the ship, and I was just amazed.
Was there a boat like the Amabilis on Slocan Lake?
No. There were a couple of tugs on there, but they were pretty rough tugs.
How did the Forest Service get around on Slocan Lake?
They had a launch at New Denver and a boathouse. 2 launches, as a matter of fact. And a boathouse, so that's the way they went. And I remember the first fire I was on was at Evans Creek. And we rented a boat from somebody local and went up to Evans Creek on this. I remember we were on one day we were going and it was a bit choppy and the water was sloshing up, and this guy was getting wet and he didn't like it. So the fellow that owned the boat had a canvas over the motor. It was an inboard motor. And this guy grabbed the thing and pulled it over him, and geez, the motor quit. Water had hit the spark plug, I guess. And Jesus, the guy that owned it, he did some cussing, I'll tell you, and got canvas back and got the motor started. It was a bit rough that day, too. But the guy didn't know any difference, But that was in those days, things were pretty rough. The piston stuck up out of the middle of the boat and spark plugs on the top, But that's, they had power boats on the Arrow Lakes too.
Like the Amabilis?
But not as big as the Amabilis. The Amabilis was pretty big.
Had it been built specially for the Forest Service?
No, I think it was bought by the construction company that built the railway from Kuskook to Proctor, about 28 or 29. I think they had to use it because there was no road there, But I think they brought it in. I'm not too sure about that, but I think they brought it in about that time.
It was an inboard diesel or inboard gas motor?
Did what?
The Amabilis had an inboard
Oh yes,
gas?
It had a diesel motor to start with. And then they changed it to gas. Yeah.
Before you had radios, how did you communicate with firefighting crews that were out for a length of time?
Walked up in the I think we did have, before my time, the year before, which was before radios, I think they did have a phone line to Duck Lake. Now they had one to Haley's, I know, because I worked on that. And I think maybe they had a phone tree line. No poles, just on a tree. But I wouldn't swear to that. So it was just a matter of, you communicated. Of course, every day there was somebody going up with grub to a crew. You know. Lots of them got out of control and out of, you know. Yeah, things were just a bit rough in those days. But everything was rough, so.
What about some of the older rangers that you worked with when you first joined the Forest Service? Do you remember any of them in particular, what they were like?
Well, Palethorpe. Palethorpe, I worked 2 years with him in New Denver. I learned an awful lot from him, you know. He taught me office procedure and the whole work. There was a guy ahead of him by the name of Matheson. And he went up north somewhere. But he was over in the Slocan for about 3 years. And then there was another fellow by the name of I remember Palethorpe when I was just a little boy in the Slocan, riding a horse. That was the transportation in those days. That would be about 24 or 5. And I think he was just a kind of a patrolman or what have you at that time, but I can remember him riding this ruddy horse. Then he came up here, and then he went to New Denver as ranger there. There was a fellow by the name of Price who was the ranger at Salmo, and maybe Nelson. When he retired, he was living in the a big hotel on Stanley Street, right where the police station was. That was several stories, and it burnt down, and he was lost with it. There were several people died in that fire.
Was he one of the original forest rangers from the beginning of the Forest Service?
He could well have been. Could well have been, yeah. Could well have been. There were several in the East Kootenay who, there was a transition period there after the war. And all those old timers left and all us new guys come on. And there was a dramatic change because the young fellows had a little different thinking towards forestry than the old timers. The old timers didn't have anything, and they made most of it, you know. So they just carried on the best they could. And then the younger ones came along, and they could see things had to be changed, and so they began to change them. A little more stiff in the regulations. Of course, the regulations changed.
Can you explain that a bit? Explain what those changes were a bit, what they meant?
Well, it changed with the times. Like in the logging, the old-timers didn't have time to go out and inspect the different operations. So there was all kinds of things went on. But then the new staff came on, more of them after the war. And so they could see that the government was losing money, so they made different regulations. So then we had to go out and inspect the logging more closely. I had a guy in East Kootenay, and he wanted this timber. And the forestry was along the Elk River, and the lower Elk in the canyon. And the officials in Nelson, and I was involved with them, they didn't want it logged because they were afraid of it was so steep, they thought it should be left to prevent slides, you know. And so this guy came from the prairie, and he had one little timber sale, and I think he had a little sawmill. This is when I was at Alco. And he applied for this timber, and I said, I'm sorry, but they've decided that you shouldn't have it. Well, he said, I'll put my application in, and I said, well, it's fine, but I said, they've already decided that you shouldn't have it. Nobody should have it. And why? Well, he'd sure like to get it. So a little while later, his application came back, and it had been refused. And he said, you know, I think you could get me that timber sale if you recommended it. And I said, well, you know what the answer is. He said, I'll tell you, it's getting near Christmas, and you'll find a fair-sized envelope on a stump down in my logging operations if I get it. I said, well, that'd be very nice. That was the end of the story right there. Anytime anybody bribed me, they weren't going to get anything, you know. And he never did. He finally folded up and left the country. But that's the only time I was ever bribed. He didn't say how much was in the envelope. There's an old timer by the name of Shoup who's in the picture there, but he wasn't. He started out at Fernie and moved to Nelson. And he became scaling inspector and eventually retired. I can't really think. There was another guy in Nelson, a fellow that was standing up in that boat, and for the life of me I can't figure out who he was. I remember the name, and I remember him being here. But did I tell you the story about falling off the 600?
No.
Every fall, at that time the 600 was still on, the railway track was there. There was nobody else in the country. So there was, one or two farmers on the way up to Trout Lake, but nobody on the track except the section crew. And on a Saturday or a Sunday, they were home anyway. So every year we used to have a little holiday. And we put in a lot of overtime. And so the local brass decided that it would be nice if everybody had a little holiday. So he'd rent the 600, and we'd all go up, and the phone line would be busy, and we'd have lunch at Poplar, where Mrs. Rear lived, and then we'd go to Gerard and have a big turkey or chicken dinner. Chicken, not turkey. And a few drinks and so forth.
With Mrs. Brandon?
Mrs. Brandon, yeah. So, this particular time, about the second or third year, I guess, we had another chap from New Denver had taken over from Palethorpe, after Palethorpe. And he came over here because there was some likelihood that he might be going to take over Kaslo. Coles was still here, so it must have been in 39. So there was Weber and Coles, and this fellow, Harry Tomlinson, and Archie Greenlaw, who was running the thing, and me. And so this Ford 600 was a rebuilt thing, and it had very substantial fenders. And so the deal was, when we left Lardeau, we get up the line a little way, and he'd stop, and so the section foreman didn't see us. Two of us would take turns and ride on the fenders. And we'd each have a turn shooting a grouse. If you missed the grouse, you got in the back and somebody else got on. So we were doing this quite merrily, and this Coles was a Cockney Englishman. A little bit of a guy, and cocky as well as Cockney. And Weber was his hired help here, and a yes man all the way around. And so they got on first. And they got bugging each other, about what they saw. And of course, weeds and grass were that high, thistles and all kinds of stuff. This is September, grouse season. And so they got bugging each other, and, there's something up there. And they'd shoot, and it'd be nothing but a tuft of weeds, So then they'd have to get in the back, and this went on all the way up. And we had lunch at Gold Hill, and it got above Poplar, and I'm sitting on the right-hand side, and can't remember who was on the left-hand side. But we're going along, watching for grouse, and all of a sudden, bam, down the front end went. And of course, I was just a youngster at the time. And it didn't disturb me because my gun was pointed that way. And when we hit, I'm running, to get ahead of this thing. I didn't know what had happened, And when I turned around to look back, here's the wheel running in the ditch. And the axle had broken. So that ended the excursion. We never got to the chicken dinner. But anyway, we got back to Poplar and Archie phoned the section foreman. And he grumbled a bit, but he said, well, yeah, he'd come. So we started walking, and pretty soon he came along with a speeder and a little flat car. We all piled on this thing. By this time it's getting dark. And we got down to Logus's place. And there were cattle on the track. And we knew there were cattle on the track, but we couldn't see. No light, no nothing. First thing we did was run into a ruddy cow. Didn't hurt it. He got stopped in time, but gave it a bump and got off the track. And then we had to be careful as we drove along that there were other cows. We got down just about a mile above the lake, and there was a rock bluff there, dark as the inside of a cow, you know. And all of a sudden there's a crash. Well, we stopped. The speeder was up on a rock, so we had to lift it off, push it back, move the rock off. I can tell you the section foreman wasn't too happy. And didn't seem to be any damage, so we got the rock off the road, and he started down the track, and the front axle was bent. And of course that tipped the wheels. And here we are going along, all the way to Lardeau. It stayed on the track, but only because he was going very, very slowly. So that ended the party. Oh, we had a few drinks and made a dinner 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock at night. So that was about the last time I was on the 600. Oh, I guess I was on after that. But that was the most interesting time anyway. Garbage truck.
Within the West Kootenays, how does the forest is different in different areas? How did that affect the Forest Service? I think
West Kootenay?
Within from Kaslo to the Duncan and the Upper Arrow Lakes, the forest.
I was in East Kootenay at the time. I think Stillwell might have been here. It really didn't affect them too much. It disrupted the boat landing at Hauser. But I think they still used it. They made a turnaround there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether they put a float in there or not. Or what? I don't know. We used to have to run a truck, old Greenlaw's truck, from Hauser over to the Hauser station, through the pass there. It was a couple of miles. Oh, you could walk. If you're, by yourself, or if Tomlinson was coming up, he'd phone, and I could walk over there about the same time it took him to come up to the station with the speeder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't remember any other accidents we had on the speeder. I can remember many bear sightings because there was nobody. In the fall, the place was full of grouse. In the summertime, it was full of bears. And they'd be down feeding on the clover and lush grass and the railway track, And lots of times we'd put an old she bear and 2 cubs, and they'd stand off and watch you go by, They were interesting. I remember coming down from Gerard one time, and I know, what was that old guy's Frenchman's name that lived at Gerard? He lived with Mrs.
Payette?
Yeah. Anyway, they had a dog, and then when the railway was taken out, I was the first one to run over the grade from Gerard to Lardeau. I engineered that. I was there when they finished, so they graded it and took the ties out and so forth. Anyway, this day I left after he did. And I got down to Poplar, which is about 10 or 11 miles. And here a long straight stretch, and see something run along the track, and I thought, or along the road. And here I got down, and it's their dog. And I thought, well, Jesus, he'll play out before he gets to Lardeau. So I stopped opposite to him and opened the door, and he hopped right in and got up in the seat. So I took him down to Lardeau, and I couldn't bear to see him run all that far, you know. As it was, his tongue was out. So when I got down there, I say, is there anything you'd like from home? And Mike, that was his name. It was a French-Canadian name. Oh, he said, thanks very much. I'm sure glad you picked it up. Yeah, everybody knew what everybody was doing because of the phone line. You couldn't take it off the hook that you didn't hear clicks all the way along the line, you know. Everybody listened. And of course, Mrs. Rear and Mrs. Brandon, they were a bit jealous of each other. So if you phoned and made arrangements to eat at one place, you better make some other arrangement to eat at the other place too. Or you'd catch hell the next time. Oh, I don't think they were very spiteful, but they were just in the same business but in different places.
If you go from the southern part of the Nelson forest region down near the border up to Revelstoke, the forest is quite different from one part
to
the
there's no
other.
question. And the East Kootenay is entirely different too. Oh, there's no question it's different. You go down past Trail, you know, that's a dry belt there. And you move up lake and it begins to change until you come over this way. Yeah, it was, the mountains are different there. They're rounder at the south end, like over in the Okanagan. And then they begin to stand on end when they get up in this country, you know. Slocan and Kootenay here, you know. But from then north, then they begin to stand on end. Oh yeah, it was pretty rugged to get around in. One of the things that continues to amaze me is how these old surveyors and the people that came in to find the passes in the first place, how they got around. Just when you think back about it, and you look over the country and think how difficult it is now, what it was then, you know. They were amazing people, you know. They didn't have to have afternoon drinks or anything, you know.
Did the differences in the forest make differences for the Forest Service?
Yes, the yellow pine, for instance, changes. There's yellow pine on the other side of the lake here, but I don't think you find any up in the Lardeau. It stops about here. And as you go further south, it gets more advanced, and the spruce stops down there. Also, true fir, Apis grandis. It's here, but it peters out as it goes north, you know. Cedar and the spruce and the hemlock and a lot of the minor species are just far north. Yeah, there's quite a variance in there. And you probably get a reasonable picture out of some of the old forestry books, which gives you the species all across Canada as far as I've heard.